Hello, and welcome to this Mayor Brown briefing, Critical Infrastructure Cybersecurity, Key Developments and Priorities for U.S. Companies. My name is Raj Day, and I lead our firm's global cybersecurity and data privacy practice, as well as serve on Mayor Brown's Global Management Committee. Before rejoining Mayor Brown in 2015, I served in various roles across the Obama administration, including at the White House, the Department of Justice, and as the General Counsel of the National Security Agency. There, and in private practice, I have had the opportunity to work on many of the important national security and cybersecurity challenges presented by attacks on our nation's critical infrastructure. I'm joined today by my colleagues Stephen Lilly and Veronica Glick, two partners in our cybersecurity and data privacy practice, both of whom regularly advise owners, operators, and manufacturers of U.S. critical infrastructure on cybersecurity matters. Stephen joined the firm in 2013 after serving as the chief counsel to the Senate Judiciary Subcommittee on Crime and Terrorism. In that role, Stephen focused on cybersecurity policy, including legislation to address cyber threats to our nation's critical infrastructure. Veronica also is a partner in our firm's cybersecurity practice with particular experience responding to cyber incidents, as well as with matters at the intersection of national security and cybersecurity. Notably, she serves on a pro bono basis as Deputy Chief Counsel for Cybersecurity and National Security to the U.S. Cyberspace Solarium Commission. We're here today to talk about the cybersecurity of critical infrastructure, which is defined as the 16 sectors whose assets, systems, and networks, whether physical or virtual, are considered so vital to the United States that their incapacitation or destruction would have a debilitating effect on physical security, national economic security, national public health or safety, or any combination. For example, this includes the chemicals, energy, communications, financial services, transportation, critical infrastructure and manufacturing, defense, and water sectors. Cyber threats to critical infrastructure have long been a focus for U.S. policymakers. Congress considered cybersecurity standards for critical infrastructure back in 2010 and 2011, for example. The Obama administration released the first version of the NIST Cybersecurity Framework for Critical Infrastructure in 2014, and it has now become a standard across all sectors of the economy. Likewise, regulators across critical infrastructure sectors have imposed cybersecurity standards or provided cybersecurity guidance that applies on a sector-by-sector basis. Policymakers are once again giving close scrutiny to the cybersecurity practices of critical infrastructure owners and operators, as well as their vendors. The Biden administration has been intensely focused on cybersecurity, and particularly the cybersecurity of critical infrastructure. Likewise, numerous bills have been put forward in Congress to address cyber threats to critical infrastructure. Recent high-profile attacks, of course, have been one key reason for this heightened attention to critical infrastructure cybersecurity. For example, the last year has seen the ransomware attack on a prominent pipeline, which resulted in temporary gasoline shortages across the East Coast, the shutdown of meat production at a leading food supplier, and an attempt to contaminate a Florida water supply. We should expect the Biden administration to maintain a consistent focus on critical infrastructure cybersecurity going forward. So what does that mean for businesses? This briefing will cover some of the most important developments for critical infrastructure cybersecurity here in the US. To be clear, the term critical infrastructure refers to a highly diverse set of assets and systems on which we all depend, from the power grid to water treatment facilities to elements of the financial system, critical manufacturing, and more. The legal frameworks governing each of these different sectors vary widely. For today's purposes, though, let me offer a few general ideas that I'd recommend U.S. critical infrastructure owners and operators and their vendors keep in mind going forward. First, the Biden administration has signaled its openness to using the full range of policy tools, from voluntary guidance to binding regulations, to achieve the administration's goal of improving the security of U.S. critical infrastructure. Second, the Biden administration may push owners and operators of critical infrastructure to make substantial changes to their cybersecurity practices in a short period of time, which may be particularly challenging for companies that operate infrastructure components that have long life cycles and are not easily updated in the field. Third, the Biden administration has indicated that it will focus on all sectors of critical infrastructure. There has been a perception that some critical infrastructure sectors are far ahead of others when it comes to cybersecurity, and the administration appears intent on closing some of those perceived gaps. And fourth, there is a high likelihood that critical infrastructure entities will be subject to any major cybersecurity legislation passed by this Congress. Now, given this outlook, it will be important for critical infrastructure companies to closely monitor applicable cybersecurity policy developments. Most directly, companies and trade associations may wish to engage with relevant regulators on any cybersecurity policies that they choose to pursue, as well as with Congress on relevant legislation. In addition, critical infrastructure companies would be prudent to monitor policies imposed on government contractors or on federal agencies themselves. While these policies may not directly apply to the companies, the government's focus on critical infrastructure cybersecurity suggests that it may seek to impose equivalent policies on the private sector as it does on itself in due course. And with that, let me turn to Stephen and Veronica to discuss some of the key recent developments that help illustrate what is now required of critical infrastructure companies and what may be coming over the horizon.
Thanks, Raj. As you mentioned, the Biden administration has been very active on cybersecurity policy, including through its recent August 25th White House event. The Biden administration is particularly focused on critical infrastructure. Two key highlights are the Biden Cyber Executive Order and the President's National Security Memorandum for owners and operators of critical infrastructure. President Biden's May 2021 Executive Order on improving the nation's cybersecurity focuses on the cybersecurity practices of federal agencies and government contractors. Although thus not primarily focused on critical infrastructure, the Cyber Executive Order has important ramifications for critical infrastructure owners and operators, regardless whether they are government contractors. First, the Cyber Executive Order highlights the importance of securing the operational technology on which many critical infrastructure companies depend. While this might seem obvious, this highlighting of OT, along with traditional information technology or IT, sends a clear signal that companies across the economy should anticipate heightened emphasis on security practices across their technological footprint, not just on their enterprise systems. Second, the Cyber Executive Order highlights government priorities that are likely to inform regulatory expectations and liability risks across critical infrastructure, even if they do not directly apply. In particular, I'd highlight three expectations that easily could be applied in the future to critical infrastructure companies by relevant regulators. First, secure software development. The Cyber Executive Order pushes for significant new standards for secure software development, including through the development of software bills of materials, or SBOMs, and the development of the concept of critical software, which NIST has defined to include software with certain attributes including managing privileges, controlling access to operational technology, or performing a function critical to trust. CISA will provide the authoritative list of software categories that are within the scope of the definition and to be included in the initial phase of implementation. These standards set under the Cyber Executive Order are likely to be highly instructive for all critical infrastructure companies going forward. Second, increased incident notification. The Cyber Executive Order launched an ongoing process to require federal contractors to report incidents to the government. Again, critical infrastructure owners and operators could see similar requirements or expectations developing in their own sectors. Third, secure architecture. The Cyber Executive Order requires federal agencies to adopt various secure architecture requirements, with a particular emphasis on moving to zero trust architecture models. These architectural requirements, though internal to the federal government, are again likely to be instructive for companies that own or operate critical infrastructure. In short, many critical infrastructure companies will not be directly affected by the Cyber EO, but still will benefit from following its continued implementation in order to gain insight into the expectations that may be coming to their critical infrastructure sector soon. These insights reach beyond the specific requirements that would be introduced pursuant to the executive order. In particular, it is notable how the Cyber EO seeks to effect significant change in cybersecurity practices in a very short period of time. The administration clearly views cybersecurity as requiring stakeholders to sprint to strengthen their cybersecurity practices. The extent to which the sprint mentality applies to critical infrastructure remains to be seen, but companies likely would be well served to anticipate similarly ambitious approaches in their sectors. Veronica, do you want to describe the National Security Memorandum next?
Thanks, Stephen. Issued in July of this year, President Biden's National Security Memorandum on improving cybersecurity for critical infrastructure control systems is premised on the view that the cybersecurity threats posed to systems that control and operate the critical infrastructure on which we all depend are among the most significant and growing issues confronting our nation. The memorandum calls on private companies to take steps to protect the country's critical infrastructure. In particular, the memorandum has two key components. The first is an information sharing provision. The memorandum notes that the federal government will work with industry to share threat information for priority control system critical infrastructure throughout the country. As part of the ICS initiative, a pilot effort was launched involving the electricity subsector this past April. As a result, over 150 electricity utilities accounting for over 90 million residential customers have participated. A similar initiative for natural gas pipelines is underway and will be followed by initiatives in the water, wastewater, and chemical sectors later this year. Notably, President Biden highlighted these initiatives at the recent August 25th White House event, emphasizing their importance to the administration. The second element of the memorandum is the direction to CISA and NIST, in collaboration with certain other agencies, to develop and issue cybersecurity performance goals for critical infrastructure. These performance goals ultimately would include baseline cybersecurity goals consistent across all critical infrastructure sectors, as well as security controls for select critical infrastructure dependent on control systems. This process to establish cybersecurity performance goals will move quickly. The Secretary of Homeland Security is required to issue preliminary goals for control system across critical infrastructure sectors by September 22nd of this year. The memorandum also calls for the development and issuance of sector-specific critical infrastructure cybersecurity performance goals by July 28th of 2022. So although the goals would not be mandatory, the impact will likely be significant. For example, the goals could influence bills considered in Congress, guide regulatory expectations, or develop into industry standards that would be taken into consideration if a cybersecurity incident leads to litigation. So speaking of regulatory expectations, Stephen, do you want to address regulatory action by the Biden administration?
Yes, thanks, Veronica. Generally speaking, the Biden administration has not relied heavily on a regulatory approach to cybersecurity so far. The notable exception has been relating to pipeline security. After the pipeline incident in May, the Transportation Safety Administration issued two binding security directives applicable to critical pipelines that transport hazardous liquids and natural gas. The first TSA security directive in May requires owners and operators of TSA-designated critical pipelines to report confirmed and potential cybersecurity incidents to CISA within 12 hours, to designate a cybersecurity coordinator to be available 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, to review current practices, and to identify any gaps and related remediation measures to address cyber-related risks and report the results to TSA and CISA within 30 days. The second TSA security directive was announced in July. It requires implementation of mitigation measures to protect against ransomware attacks and other threats to IT and OT networks, a cybersecurity contingency and recovery plan, and an annual cybersecurity architecture design review. These pipeline cybersecurity directives represent a notable shift from 20 years of voluntary guidelines in this context. While the Biden administration has not pursued such a regulatory approach broadly across sectors, The pipeline directives highlight its willingness to use a regulatory toolkit and to push regulated companies to make rapid and significant changes to their cybersecurity practices. Indeed, these changes go well beyond leveling up with prevailing cybersecurity best practices. The creation of extremely short notification timelines and 24/7 security officer availability requirements, for example, signal that expectations may be evolving to encompass such practices. Companies in other sectors will consequently want to take note of these requirements and evaluate whether they might become legal requirements or best practices in their own industries, and if so, how their company would react. While regulatory requirements in different sectors are often ill-fitting once applied to another critical infrastructure sector, all critical infrastructure companies will benefit from contemplating the possibility of rapid changes in cybersecurity requirements and best practices in their sector. In particular, companies should consider whether they have appropriate internal governance structures and robust relationships among key stakeholders that would enable them to respond in a timely and nimble fashion to changes in governing regulations or legal expectations. The pipeline directives also highlight key elements that companies across sectors can likely expect in future cybersecurity regulation. These include information sharing, risk and gap analysis for both cyber resilience and incident response, personnel requirements, including hiring a designated head of security and training employees, policies, including documented processes for system security and incident response that accurately reflect current practices, and specific technical measures to secure systems, including common cyber hygiene measures, such as use of multi-factor authentication, as well as tools to monitor and respond to intrusions, patch management, access controls, and defense in depth. We've already talked about information sharing, but I'd emphasize one practical point here. Incident reporting requirements presume that a company has the ability to identify potential and/or actual cyber incidents. However, identifying cyber incidents can often be extremely difficult in operational technology environments that sit at the core of much of U.S. critical infrastructure. Likewise, security requirements that may be applied to enterprise systems fairly readily may be extremely difficult to apply in OT networks. Companies consequently may be well served to consider practical impediments they may face in meeting similar regulatory requirements where they transfer to their own industry and apply to OT networks. Of course, regulators have an extensive toolkit that they can use to influence industry behavior. And on that note, let me turn it back to Veronica to discuss the use of voluntary approaches to enhancing cybersecurity.
Thanks, Stephen. The Biden administration has signaled its interest in using a range of non-regulatory approaches to enhance the cybersecurity of critical infrastructure. For example, in April 2021, the Biden administration first launched the Industrial Control System Cybersecurity Initiative. As I mentioned earlier, this initiative was kicked off with a 100-day action plan for the U.S. electricity subsector, led by the Department of Energy, in coordination with CISA and the Electricity Subsector Coordination Council, which includes a range of electric company and trade association representatives. With additional participation from the NSA's Cyber Directorate, the initiative developed a set of ICS monitoring technology evaluation considerations for the electricity subsector. These considerations set out a list of monitoring technology recommendations and also note that the government intends to work with entities and other private sector stakeholders to integrate, to the maximum extent possible, information sharing with any ICS monitoring technology. These considerations are not mandatory. However, in practice, companies that do not or choose not to incorporate them may face a situation in which litigants, consumers, regulators, or the press may ask why they do not comply. Another example of voluntary standards is within the water subsector. As some of you may know, there was an incident that did not gather quite as much news as the pipeline attack that involved unidentified cyber actors that obtained unauthorized access to the SCADA systems at a U.S. drinking water treatment facility in Florida. The threat actor increased the amount of a corrosive chemical used as part of a water treatment process, but thankfully the issue was identified before the water was impacted. Nonetheless, this is understandably a very concerning situation, And CISA, the FBI, the EPA, and the Multi-State Information Sharing and Analysis Center, the MSISAC, released a joint cybersecurity advisory. This advisory recommends some mitigation steps, which include some of the technical cyber hygiene steps that Stephen mentioned a moment ago, such as multi-factor authentication. One final non-regulatory action was the National Security Agency's release in April of this year of the Cybersecurity Advisory, Stop Malicious Cyber Activity Against Connected Operational Technology for the government and DIB operational technology owners and operators. This advisory sets out the recommendations to improve OT security, including ways to evaluate risk, and in particular to limit IT-OT connections to reduce the possible surfaces of attack. Again, these are voluntary recommendations, but it provides an insight into the types of steps that may become mandatory through industry-specific regulation or new legislation. This advisory reinforces the focus that Stephen mentioned on operational technology, the hardware and software that controls industrial equipment, also known as OT. So not all OT is critical infrastructure, and not all critical infrastructure, such as the financial sector, uses OT. However, there is significant overlap for energy, chemical, DIB, and other industries, for example. And cybersecurity for OT raises a host of challenges that makes it more difficult to manage than IT cybersecurity. We won't delve into those here, but the challenges are both technical and practical. From a technical perspective, for example, a company may have limited visibility into its operational environments and likely will be operating on older systems with longer life cycles that may not be readily patched. From a practical perspective, legal and IT teams may be familiar working together on cybersecurity issues in general, but the teams responsible for securing OT may not have had that same close relationship with the legal function and other key stakeholders. As a result, legal teams for critical infrastructure may wish to ensure that they have appropriate relationships with key OT security stakeholders, both so that they can support those stakeholders on legal questions and maintain visibility into potential legal risks from the state of the company's cybersecurity program. It's also worth noting that there's a new CISA Cybersecurity Advisory Committee that includes committee members with subject matter expertise in a range of critical infrastructure sectors. And there is also a new Joint Cyber Defense Collaborative focused on cyber defense planning, composed of representatives from across the federal government that will consult with voluntary partners in the critical infrastructure sectors. So overall, really, there are a lot of agencies involved in critical infrastructure cybersecurity, from sector-specific agencies to other agencies with national security mandates, including the Committee on Foreign Investment in the United States, or CFIUS.
Thanks, Stephen and Veronica. That really was a great summary of some of the key steps taken within the executive branch. But there's also increasing attention of lawmakers on both sides of the aisle to the growing risk of cyber attacks on critical infrastructure. Could you speak to some of the developments on the Hill and what this means for critical infrastructure companies?
Absolutely. There's been significant debate around a range of legislative proposals relating to cybersecurity practices within U.S. critical infrastructure. As most of you are likely aware, one of the key areas of debate has been around the required reporting of cybersecurity incidents. Leading members of the House and Senate have introduced competing bills, and a broad coalition of industry stakeholders have identified key principles that Congress should follow to establish a workable approach. The specifics of each piece of legislation and their respective prospects are beyond the scope of this session. That said, one of the most important questions that Congress will likely resolve in any cybersecurity incident reporting legislation is the scope of companies that are subject to its requirements. Critical infrastructure owners and operators should expect that they are likely to fall in scope for such legislation if it proceeds, so would likely be well served to monitor its progress through Congress and consider the compliance requirements the company would be required to meet if passed into law.
Another important piece of legislation currently being considered by Congress is the bipartisan bill introduced earlier this August in the Senate, the Defense of United States Infrastructure Act, aimed at strengthening the United States cybersecurity posture. The bill was introduced by Senators Angus King, co-chair of the Cyberspace Solarium Commission, Mike Rounds, and Ben Sass. One of the provisions of the bill includes a Cyberspace Solarium Commission recommendation to protect the nation's systemically important critical infrastructure, SICI. If passed, this would be a very significant piece of legislation for critical infrastructure companies. The bill provides for the creation of a new designation for critical infrastructure whose disruption is likely to cause severe damage to national security, economic security, or public health and safety, likely to include elements of the power grid, financial sector, water systems, and others. Subsequently, there would be determinations of appropriate benefits and burdens for these SICI designated entities. The infrastructure bill that passed the Senate this August with bipartisan support also incorporated the Cyber Response and Recovery Act, which would authorize the DHS secretary working with the National Cyber Director to declare a significant cyber incident in the event of an ongoing or imminent attack that would impact national security, economic security, or government operations. This declaration would trigger CISA to coordinate response effort and permits the DHS secretary access to a cyber response and recovery fund that would help support federal and non-federal entities as they respond and recover from significant cyber attacks. This could also be quite a significant change that would need to be incorporated into incident response planning. There are also sector-specific developments which may lead to increased regulation. For example, in May, the House of Representatives Energy and Commerce Committee reintroduced the Pipeline and LNG Facility Cybersecurity Preparedness Act, which would require the Department of Energy to create a program for regulating pipeline and LNG facility cybersecurity. So in sum, there have been a lot of legislative developments and more on the horizon that will impact how companies prepare for and respond to incidents. Rather than delve further into the details, we would note that the key focus of the discussion on the Hill is how to scope and assign responsibilities for cybersecurity among the government and private sector. Critical infrastructure is a natural group to receive the most scrutiny and be subject to new rules, with entities that qualify as SICI being the most exposed to change and stringent expectations in the near term.
Great, thanks so much, Veronica. Before we close, it would be helpful to summarize some key priorities for critical infrastructure companies as they respond to these cybersecurity policy developments. Stephen, maybe I could turn it to you to cover key priorities for critical infrastructure companies.
Yes, happy to. As this briefing hopefully makes clear, there is a lot of ongoing policy activity related to the cybersecurity of U.S. critical infrastructure. As a result, one basic priority for critical infrastructure companies should be staying up to date on these policy developments and thinking through how they affect their individual businesses and cybersecurity programs. Moreover, critical infrastructure companies may well benefit from engaging with their regulators or with Congress on these policies, either directly or through relevant trade associations. Simply put, now is an important time for owners and operators of critical infrastructure to weigh in on the development of cyber policy. As Raj mentioned, of course, critical infrastructure is a broad term that includes a wide range of companies across sectors. The specific cybersecurity requirements and expectations that will apply to an owner or operator of critical infrastructure will differ by sector. Generally speaking, however, regardless of the specific regulatory framework to which a company is subject, it also will be prudent for companies across sectors to ensure that their cybersecurity programs meet prevailing best practices. While the elements of an appropriate cybersecurity program are beyond the scope of this briefing, legal counsel considering their cybersecurity programs should think about their key building blocks, including the risk assessment upon which the program is based, the plans and policies that govern the program, the contractual provisions that govern third parties, and oversight of the program by senior executives and the board of directors.
Great, thanks so much, Stephen. And thanks to you, all of our attendees, for joining us today. We appreciate you taking the time to join us, and we hope you found this briefing useful. Please feel free to reach out to any of us by email if you have questions or would like to discuss any of the topics that we covered. Thanks so much and have a great day.